We're going to break up our discussion of mixed reverb into 3 different videos, this being the first one, which is going to be a presentation talking about reverb in the mix, kind of the evolution of this, and some of the things that you want to consider and might be helpful to know before you start dropping a bunch of reverbs in and potentially taking it a little bit too far, which is very easy to do. So some questions to consider. This first question is identical really to what we looked at with delay. Is there any inherent reverb built into the stems? Was reverb added during production? If the answer is yes, and you have no way of separating that, you have to work with it, and you're not going to spend time adding quote unquote production or enhancement reverb during the mix. So if you have something that's totally dry, maybe you hear that there's a particular instrument, maybe a synthesizer, maybe a guitar that you feel could use some kind of specialty reverb, and you go and you apply it. I mean, that's kind of what the Tal 4 reverb was for us in the production stage. So commonly now, you probably will get stems that do have reverb built into them, unless it's something that's purely instrumental, that's just been recorded raw, and they're sending you over those stems. And if that's the case, then you do have to think about reverb from the enhancement production style, and not just specifically a mixed reverb. Another question that's really worth asking and something that you need to listen for: how dense is the instrumentation and how much space is there for a mixed reverb? If you have a pretty fast BPM or the parts that are played are very fast, will a long decay time, will that cause bleed? Will the one decay from one note start to bleed into the other one? How does that factor in? Do you like the sound of that? Do you not like the sound of that? Or is the instrumentation very minimal? Is it sparse? Is there a lot of room for you to fill in with something like a reverb? Is that going to help the overall track? And at least in 2016, a lot of production is going more to a minimal style where you really start to hear and feel that reverb, and it almost becomes an instrument and an element on its own. What parts will and won't benefit from reverb? And that's true for both a production reverb and also a mixed reverb. There's certain things that just simply probably do not need reverb, or if they do, it's really, really subtle, small amounts where you don't even really hear it as much as it's something that's kind of just like perceptual. So you feel it maybe a little more than you actually can say, there's reverb on there. Will it be necessary to have more than one reverb? AKA, do I need a specialty reverb for a particular part? For example, for the snare drum, do I want something special for that? Do I want a particular room for my drums to all fit together? Or did the parallel compression maybe solve that? Do I want something different for the vocal? Or do I just want to put everything into one room? And every single strategy, every single idea there is completely plausible, and it's up to you and what you think is going to work best for that track. It's not this is the right way for this style of music, even though I think if you listen to a lot of music, you might draw some of those conclusions. So the purpose of the mixed reverb. A mixed reverb is fundamentally different from a production reverb in that it is designed to be used on multiple parts. So we come back to send and return being probably the most logical thing to do here, and to add cohesion. Okay, so with cohesion, we're not talking about anything extreme. Extreme takes away from a cohesive feeling. You notice it more. If there's a lot of reverb, that becomes the main element. That's what you focus on. And that's okay, but is it bringing the track together, or is it actually breaking the track apart? That's a question and a consideration you have to make. The overall goal is to put your song, and this is very cliche, but into a space, or at the very least to add some sense of depth. So when I say into a space, what I'm really meaning here, and this is a generalization, is that you want to put your track into a room, into a hall, a real life space where you typically do listen to music. But for some styles of music that are really better enjoyed, very dry, that are going to be made very loud later on, putting them into a hall or putting them into a room doesn't really work, in which case that reverb isn't emulating a real space, but it's kind of just emulating something that's, it's still a real space, but something very, very dry, a location that you probably wouldn't encounter on a normal day's basis, unless you work in a, recording studio and you have something like a vocal booth, for example. So we'll talk about this a little bit more as we move further. But for the most part, for most tracks, you are thinking about like a room or a hall when you talk about a mixed reverb. This reverb may not necessarily be heard. Like I just said, this comes down to an idea of early reflections versus the reverb, which we will talk about, but you should still be able to perceive it, and it should still be serving the role that you want it to serve. And that would probably be some kind of a gluing or a cohesive role. So what's appropriate? What reverb do I want to use for this genre? Which reverb do I want to use? And like everything else we've said, it's a matter of taste. Washing something out in reverb is totally fine if that's your aesthetic preference. There's no rule saying that you can't. Maybe 90% of people won't like what you've done, but if you really like it and you have a reason for doing it, who am I to argue with you? But generally, the principle with mixed reverb is that less is more, and this is part of the reason why we've held off on this discussion of reverb for so long. It's easy to overdo it if it's the first thing that you do when you go into the mix. You go and you start dropping on all your different reverbs, and you start to, send some things in there before really getting the balances right. And it can lead to too much reverb on the whole, and I know I, for one, am extremely guilty of this. I used to do that all the time because I just loved the sound and effect of reverb, which we all do. But for that reason, you need to be even more careful about it and how much that you use. And again, a general principle here is the fewer the tracks, the more reverb that can be used, the more audible it can become, and the longer RT60 or the decay time. Okay, RT60 just means how long does it take for the reverb to decay by 60 dB. Not the same thing as how long does it take to go to 0 or to silence, but once something drops by 60 dB, you probably can't really hear it anymore anyway. And the more tracks you have, again, a generalization, less reverb and shorter decay times on that reverb. There are obviously exceptions, but this is the general principle, and this seems to be the way reverb is most commonly applied during the mixing stage. So let's talk about some examples, and we have here the 4 Bs: Britney, Beyonce, Blake, and Bach, to round things out. And this is a very simple and easy thing that you can do on your own. If you have the CDs and something that is a lossless format, so no compression, you'll hear this even better. But even before I sat down to record this video, I listened to each of these tracks, even in something like YouTube, and you can very easily hear the difference in the role that reverb applies. So we're going to have Britney Spears' song Toxic, Beyonce's song Partition, James Blake's song Limit to Your Love, and of course, we couldn't have any Bs and not mention Bach with the Toccata and Fugue in D minor. And I guess I will link to all these videos in the description, but you can also just as easily sort them out and listen. And what I would encourage, because I'm going to draw all the conclusions for you, is that you pause the video, you listen to these tracks, and you listen specifically for any audible reverb. And I would also add to that audible delays you can hear. Specifically with something like Britney and Beyonce, really listen to those delays. And what you're going to notice is that with modern music and with pop music in general, delay may play a more crucial role than audible reverb in adding a sense of space, and filling in the gaps. So go ahead, pause the video, listen to these tracks. You have to reserve all judgment. If you want to get better as a mix engineer, if you want to get better as an artist, as a creator, as a producer, you need to reserve all judgments. You have to check your ego and your preference at the door, because trust me, there's a lot you can learn from every one of these mixes, even if these artists are not your cup of tea. So pause the video, take a listen, think about it. All right, so my analysis to these tracks, and I don't have the most discerning ear in the world, so feel free to contradict me and raise your own points. But let's start with Britney Spears' song Toxic. And in my opinion, for a modern pop song, I think the instrumentation is relatively sparse. However, this is a perfect example of the hyper dry pop aesthetic that really kind of shocks you. To go back and listen to Toxic compared to maybe the music that you listen to now or the music that you enjoy, unless you really enjoy Britney Spears, it gives you a little bit of a jolt. I mean, it definitely did to me when I went back and just listened to it. Instead of noticeable reverb, short delays, and other doubling effects, or things just like early reflections, are used to add perceived space and depth. You'll notice how on some of the vocal delays you can hear an audible reverb, but the lead is left raw. Maybe there were some early reflections and some other kind of specialty effects, but for the most part, that lead vocal is just in your face. It's up front. It's as if Britney was singing right at you, right in front of you. Okay, and then the delays are kind of coming from behind you. And we're going to come back to this point a little later on, but that's an important thing. No reverb on a voice tends to be unnatural, and part of the reason I think pop singers are often criticized for their vocal prowess, also as an effect, like autotune or something like Melodyne, you can hear that easier when there's very little reverb that's been applied or almost no reverb. And if you're a critical listener and you know what the artifacts and what those algorithms kind of sound like, you can hear the pitch correction. And again, that's probably a reason why there's so much criticism hurled at pop singers as compared to other popular singers who really may not be any more or less talented. If you get some reverb on there, some like lush, really dense reverb, I think as a listener, you're a little more willing to let some of those things go, okay? But again, and also in the modern day too, you know, Melodyne and Autotune, they've gotten so good that it's becoming harder and harder to really hear it, even if the vocal is left really dry. Moving on now to Beyonce and the song Partition. This is a fairly minimal production style that has become quite popular, at least in 2015, 2016. With the Beyonce song, you'll notice how her voice is left very dry. Again, you don't really hear that decay. But as compared to Britney, where everything was very dry, here, Beyonce's voice is left dry so that they can create this difference between her voice and the rest of the instrumentation, which is treated with fairly liberal amounts of reverb. Still, you know, short times to some extent, but a lot of reverb, and you can definitely hear it. And I will say as well, it does help to have access to the best vocal microphones, because the better the microphone, you know, it tends to need less reverb in general. Typically, a Beyonce track will tend to lean closer towards Britney and reverb when we talk about instrumentation and voice. So if you want another good example of something that kind of bridges these gaps as we go through, listen to the Sierra song, Dance Like We're Making Love. Okay, that's a perfect example of a minimal production style where reverb has kind of been added to almost everything and it's used to fill a lot of space. Okay, so minimal instrumentation means more room for reverb on both the voice and instruments. On to James Blake, Limit to Your Love, even more minimal production aesthetic where every part can be picked out and really focused on by the listener. So there's not a lot of different instruments, there's not a lot of sounds, but each sound is interesting and each sound really plays well off the other. So again, there's a lot of room in this song for reverb to fill in the gaps, and that's exactly the role it plays here. Another example from James Blake, I believe it's even the same album, is the Wilhelm Scream. And what I want you to notice in that song is how the vocals in some parts have a lot of reverb applied and then other things don't. So just like with Beyonce, there's that idea. There's always that you need that context. You need something to put it into comparison with. For something to be really wet, you want to have something dry. And I think James Blake and the mixes, whoever did those mixes, maybe it was him, maybe it was somebody else, really illustrates that idea, I think, very well. And last but not least, the classic, of course, Bach's, most famous fugue. And what I wrote here just to start is one doesn't exist without the other. A Bach fugue, like the Toccata and Fugue in D minor, played on the piano or played on a guitar in a small room without a lot of reverb, just doesn't have the same power and effect that you get when you hear it in a cathedral on a really massive style pipe organ. There's just no way of putting those into, they're different songs. Honestly, they sound totally different. The reverb plays a critical role in adding to the sheer power this work held and continues to hold today. It was composed originally for a pipe organ in a cathedral. Bach was well aware of this, and he understood the reverb of the cathedral in which he worked. And what you'll notice with many orchestral classics, so to speak, Baroque, classical, romantic, and even up to the modern day, composers really think about and compose to the room that they are in, or to the room that the music is going to be played back in, whether that's a large concert hall or, an intimate setting. So think about the difference between a string quartet in a small room, like a practice room if you're listening to that, as compared to a symphony in the famous concert hall in Vienna. I won't go and botch that name, but I'm sure many of you have heard of it. It's very well known for its slightly longer reverb than most of the halls. So definitely something to think about, and even consider listening to the same piece of music performed in different halls and how that reverb characteristic plays in. So there you go. Those were our examples here. Why have we waited so long to get to the mixed reverb? And what I'm assuming is that the production reverb has already been applied here. Okay, if it hasn't, you probably will want to go in a little bit earlier on at the track level or even maybe the group level and apply some, enhancement, creative style reverb effects, specifically for vocals and synthesizers, which usually work well with what I wrote here, unnatural reverb. So not space simulations and not spaces specifically, like if it's convolution. So like things like plates and springs tend to work well on, guitars, on synthesizers, springs not so much on voices, but plates definitely. And it works as more of an enhancement, as kind of a special effect, whereas the mixed reverb is, again, that thing that's more of the glue, more of a cohesive element. And it's the same idea, like I said here, with guitar amps that you might see with spring reverbs. It's because spring reverbs sound pretty good on guitars. It gives it a unique characteristic, and that's something that you probably are going to apply before you get into that final mixed reverb to bring things together. This is a bullet that can't be restated enough. Mixed reverb is the single easiest thing to overdo, and you have to separate out production reverb versus mixed reverb. So mixed reverb is the single easiest thing to overdo. If your mix is almost there by the time you get to the reverb, you'll start to think of this more as a subtle enhancement, more as that final little, nail in the coffin, so to speak. Then you will think about it as trying to save the mix, okay? If you get to it early on, you want your mix to sound good without mixed reverb is kind of the point I'm trying to make here. And also remember that changing volume levels will impact the reverb balance. So if you go in and set reverbs before you've set your before you've set your compression and EQ, it can then cause some imbalances with your send levels that you have going into the reverb, and you'll have to go back and make up for them unless you're sending everything in pre, and even then you'll still probably need to go back and make adjustments. So as I put here at the bottom, for me, it's a personal preference to go in and set the mix reverb really as one of the very final things that I do. And the reason is because it's worked well for me, and I didn't used to always do this. I used to kind of do it early on, but putting it to the end has helped me pull back on mixed reverb, not try to use it as a fix and just use it as a really subtle enhancement. But feel free to experiment bringing reverb in whenever you want, and also feel free to use as much as you want. There are no rules here. These are all guidelines. These are just guiding principles. As long as you have a reason, feel free to do whatever you want. So specialty reverbs, we've talked about specialty EQ, we've talked about specialty compressors. We're not really going to talk about specialty reverbs so much, but you can think of the Tal 4 as one, which is more of like an emulation of a very dense plate. But just like we've seen specialty EQs and reverbs, there are also plenty of, specialty EQs and compressors. There are also plenty of specialty reverbs out there on the market, both in hardware and now I'd say more so specifically in software. This is one of the processors where there's still a lot of evolution and new ideas coming out, which I think is great. Specifically, we are talking about reverbs that don't look to emulate or sound like real spaces, something that we've talked about before. Acoustically speaking, everything can vibrate if excited enough, so any material could theoretically act as a reverb. So sometimes you'll see reverb algorithms that are supposed to be like wood, just like a wooden table. What would it sound like if I played my guitar just over that wood table and was able to get that effect? All right, something like that. Or, maybe make an algorithm that's supposed to be like outer space, or that's supposed to be like a forest, or anything, even things that don't exist at all, just theoretical concepts. People can do that with reverb, and I think it's why I find reverb so interesting and so special, and something that's still worth looking into further, really. Plates and springs, apart from the algorithms that I just mentioned, are more the physical examples of reverbs that act more so as a specialty reverb versus a mixed reverb, and we have looked at one of those already, which I would say is the Tal 4. So mixed verb settings. All right, how are we going to set this up? A mixed reverb is traditionally thought of as simulation of a real space. So a room, a hall, or a chamber, which is also just a room. And this can be done either through algorithmic means, where you just have a bunch of delay lines, which is similar to the way, your voice actually does spread out in a room, or any instrument spreads in a room, and all of the different reflections and, everything that comes back to you. That's really the reverb, and it can be done with tons of delays. Or you could go with something like a convolution reverb, which is designed and supposed to be more real, but it can be very difficult to tweak those settings. So it's not as if one is more appropriate than the other. We're only going to be looking at algorithmic reverbs in this particular course, but convolution might be something you want to explore later on down the road. The settings tend to approximate acoustic principles. So when you're going with these reverbs where you're simulating a real space, even if it's an algorithm, they're trying to approximate and emulate the actual principles that a room might have. So the shape of that room, the building materials, is there any absorptive material on the wall? All of those things are usually taken into account in one of these algorithms, in these emulations. So for this reason, if you don't have a really good understanding of acoustics, which I'm guessing most of you don't, starting with presets is really totally fine here. And actually in some ways might be beneficial to trying to start from scratch. It's a little bit easier to tweak the preset to get it where you want it to be and have it emulate what you actually want it to emulate versus trying to start from complete scratch. Some reverbs have hundreds of parameters, some have just a few, so you'll have to kind of make those determinations on your own. Speaking of room acoustics, we're going to look at a couple of different basic room acoustic principles that are probably worth knowing before you start to work with any kind of a mixed reverb. The first idea here is absorption versus reflection, and really these things go hand in hand. So when you talk, or when an instrument plays a note, what's happening is sound waves are being generated. The air pressure is fluctuating, but there is something that has now gone out, and it is energy. So, your vocal cords vibrate. That's that initial energy from the air that's coming up from your lungs. That energy is then transmitted into the actual air, into the environment that you're in. And then that energy needs to be absorbed, or it will be reflected in some way. Okay, so if you're in an anechoic chamber, which is designed to limit reverb almost entirely, and you scream in that anechoic chamber, the absorptive materials on the wall and on the floor and all over the place are going to make it so that you don't hear any sort of reflections. Those are all limited and it sounds like there's no reverb. Versus if you're in a bathroom, which may be much smaller than that anechoic chamber, it's made completely of tile, which is a very reflective surface, it's going to take much longer for all that energy to get absorbed. And we'll talk more about that as we move on here. So the material absorption coefficient is really just how any given material is going to absorb sounds at a frequency range. So it usually gets divided up into, like low, mid, high frequencies. How good is that material at absorbing sound waves at a certain frequency? So this means that depending on the materials used, it would be very possible that a room might have a much longer decay time than a hall. So the shape of the room, the dimensions of the room, as well as the materials play equally important roles. So it's not as though a larger space automatically equals a longer decay time. It just doesn't work that way. So that's something that you want to get out of your head right now. Like I said before, if you're in a bathroom, very reflective tile surface as compared to that anechoic chamber, you'll know the difference immediately. And what I just said before, absorption is not uniform across the frequency spectrum. Low frequencies, they are much larger. They take up much more space. They are a lot harder to absorb and therefore usually take longer to decay away. And this is why commonly in reverb programs, you get the ability to change the overall length of the decay time based on frequency settings. So you'll have, low frequencies, mid frequencies, high frequencies, and commonly you see on the low, maybe it's 1.25 times longer. In the middle, it's like 1.10, and then at the highs, you have like 1.0. Because really, when we talk about, energy in general, there has to be this law of conservation of energy. Energy cannot just simply be created from nowhere or destroyed from nowhere. It has to be transferred. And when we talk about sound waves, we're really thinking about this energy being transferred to heat. And with your high frequencies, in general, those can very easily be absorbed in the air. Just that simple transfer, they die down very quickly. But low frequencies, it's a little bit more difficult. So, that process, that friction process, you need a lot more. You need a dense material, in your corners to try and trap the bass so that when the sound wave hits it, it goes through it a little bit. Some is absorbed, it bounces off the wall, it comes back, and you're hoping to absorb as much of that as possible. So, and in that transfer that's happening there is a transfer to heat. It's friction. You're not going to feel it, but that is what's going on there. All right. So higher frequencies, small waves are easily absorbed a lot just by the air, by nearly any material, as compared to low frequencies, which tend to reflect more energy and thus decay at much slower rates. So here's the example. All right, we have a small tiled room on the right here. This is a very reflective surface. We can imagine it's something like tile in a very small room. This will have a fairly long reverb decay time. With nothing to absorb the sound waves, that decay just lingers on and on and on. And again, if you continue to sing, that reverb may continue to build up. And after you stop, it takes a decent amount of time for it to all decay away. And then on the left, we have something that might be a much larger space, like a dry recording studio, or specifically a room designed to record a dry vocal. And conversely, a more absorptive material, plywood maybe, will absorb more of the initial reflections, leading to a drier space and shorter reverb times. Additional absorptive materials can also be strategically placed to cut down on reverb, and this is again specifically to try and tame the low frequencies a bit more so that you have an even balanced room, or you can even try to just eliminate, as much reverb as possible, and that's what you see with like a vocal booth, for example. Room acoustic principle number 2, direct signal versus early reflections versus the actual reverb. So on the picture to the left, I want you to imagine that the triangle is the speaker or the sound source. And so if you are standing directly in front of that speaker, you get hit with a lot of direct signal. And so it's very clear. You don't necessarily hear any reverb. You maybe get the early reflections, which are happening and traveling so fast, but it takes time for then the reverb to come back and kind of hit you. And this yellow ball is supposed to be the reverb that slowly envelops the entire room. And these blue lines here are what we would consider to be more of the early reflections, okay? So this all happens very quickly, but if you're right in front of the speaker, it hits you almost immediately and you really hear it. It's very clear. And just think of like the Britney Spears song, for example. It's like she's standing directly in front of us just singing, and then sometimes we get those delays, and that's almost like we're in a big space and it's taking a long time for all of that to build up and come back to us. So just think about this in general, and maybe some of you have had experiences like this. I know I have, where if you sit like in a concert hall and you're way in the back and maybe you're even pushed towards a corner of that concert hall, you're not hearing a whole lot of direct signal. You're getting that direct signal after it's already had a lot of reverb and early reflections built up. And so it kind of creates this sound where the reverb really seems to be a part of it. Whereas if you're sitting in the front row, or if you're the conductor and you're conducting, you hear the direct signal, and then it takes a bit of time for you to then hear that reverb, which is kind of then, you have the sensation of it happening behind you. Okay, so this is us thinking about trying to emulate this realistic principle with the plugins that we have. And we'll talk about then how those settings correspond to these different ideas. But really, overall here, you don't have to follow these rules. You don't have to follow these principles, but these are the guidelines that have kind of shaped the way people work with reverb, at least fundamentally on a pretty easy level. And so I hope that maybe you'll be able to take these ideas and apply them to your own mix based on what you want. Do you want the speaker, or excuse me, do you want the listener to be in the back of the room, kind of hearing as though the sound and the reverb are coming to them at the same time? Or do you want the sound source to be right in front of your listener? in something like the Britney Spears example that we were able to listen to earlier on. Okay, and in that example, it's almost as if every instrument is right in front of you, but you can get creative and experimental with this. So maybe you'd prefer for the cello or the strings to be way behind the singer, in which case you probably want a little more reverb attached to those, a much shorter pre-delay time, so that it comes and feels like that's from farther away as compared to that speaker or that singer who might be right in front of you. And so you're getting a lot of direct signal, and it's taking a lot longer to then hear the reverb. So those are the two acoustic principles that we're going to think about when applying our mixed reverb and the settings that we're going to use. So here are the main ideas: production reverb versus mixed reverb. Okay, I really don't need to repeat these ideas, but the production reverb is really where the reverb is just acting more as an effect. So like with a synthesizer, you might go a little overboard with it, but that's okay because that's part of the sound. You're not thinking about trying to put everything together, and that's really what the mixed reverb is for. That's the fundamental purpose of it. Let's put everything together here. You need to think about the instrumentation. How much instrumentation is there and how much room is there for reverb? And then you also want to consider how all these parts are going to fit in that space. So where do you want to place the listener in relation to all the parts? What we just talked about before. Do you want the vocalist to be right in front of them? Do you want the cello to be way off at the back of the stage? Do you want the guitar to be maybe slightly to the left, but still pretty close? That's how you're making these determinations, not only with your balances, which you've already set, but also with your reverbs and how much reverb that you apply. So if the listener is right in front of an instrument, they will mostly hear the direct signal detached from the reverb, which will arrive sometime later. Compare that to if the listener is in the back of the room, where they will hear a mixture of direct signal, early reflections, and reverb, all arriving at approximately the same time. All right, so now that we've got all of that out of the way, we can finally go into the digital audio workstation and take a look at a couple of different examples using different reverbs.